I'm here with author and MacArthur Fellowship recipient Octavia Butler. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Take a moment and tell us about your most recent work.
My most recent published novel is Parable of the Talents, and it is a continuation of the story I was telling in Parable of the Sower. So this is kind of the autobiography of a person who, well, a fictional person, who begins a new religion and sends us off to other worlds by way of that religion.
Do you think that that work and the success of Parable of the Sower, its predecessor, was a breakthrough work for you?
I hoped it would be. I'm not sure that it has been. I've seen it reviewed as though it were just one more cheesy little science fiction novel by somebody who didn't read the book but read the cover copy. So I haven't escaped that.
Do you think of yourself as a science fiction writer?
No, on my business card it says writer.
What's the problem with being a science fiction author?
Well, in spite of the freedom that it gives you to examine almost any theme that you can think of, it's confining in the sense that a lot of people think science fiction is Star Wars, and you have to be about 14 to enjoy it. And if you're any older than 14, well, you should be reading literature, whatever that is.
People have sometimes suggested that being a black woman is a primary influence on your work. I'm not going to ask you that question. I'm wondering whether you think that being a white male author is a primary influence on some of your colleagues' work.
Oh my, that's something you would really have to ask them. I just did my race panel. One of the things I said, I had thought that I wasn't going to do the panel. One of the things I said to them was, you know, I've been doing the race panel since the 70s, and I almost didn't show up for this one. But I've decided that one of the things we could do is make it kind of the race and sex panel. It was actually race, caste, and culture. So I added sex to that and spiced up the room. It made everything nice and lively.
Of those, which do you think is the most, to use the word, marginalized in the field?
Oh my. Oddly enough, I don't think anybody talked about caste, or the usual word for it, class. I don't think it's so much marginalized as just ignored. People are not afraid to tackle it, it just doesn't occur to them. So I think oftentimes it just sort of gets left out.
Do you think that's a product of American culture, where class is so downplayed as an issue?
Downplayed as an issue, but not really. I mean, after all, if you go to the right schools and all that, make the right contacts, of course you're going to have a heck of a lot better chance to, you know, have a better life in this country. So of course class matters. I suspect so, though. I suspect it's more of an American thing. It's not a bad thing, really, that we tend to pretend, at least, that class isn't an issue, because I suppose the more we pretend it isn't an issue, the less perhaps that it will be. I'm not sure that's true, but it's the hopeful note that I pull from the whole business.
I'm interested in the idea of telling stories as creating self-fulfilling prophecy. Do you think that's part of what your role is?
Or perhaps for not so much self-fulfilling prophecy as I can't think of the word. The sorts of things that therapists do when they're trying to rid you of a phobia, and they do it by dumping whatever you're afraid of onto you or you onto it.
Aversion therapy?
Desensitization.
Do you deliberately in your work strive for that, to desensitize people on some of these issues?
No, it's not a matter of deliberately doing it. It's just a matter of behaving as though the world were a little bit more as you wish it were in some way. So my characters, who are often black and female, behave as though they have no limitations. And they don't run around saying, look at me, I'm black, I'm female, I have no limitations. They just behave this way and do what they need to do.
You mentioned that you were reluctant to do another panel about writers of color and stories about people of color.
They're just tiresome. I mean, you say the same stuff over and over. You get tired of doing anything that you've been doing for 20 or so years.
Well, tell me, I mean, has it been difficult being one of a very, very few members?
No. It's been interesting. I think, as I said on the panel, the problem that we have more than race, color, class, or whatever is those two words, science fiction. Because people tend to presume that they know what it is and they don't like it. And as I said, you have to be 14 to enjoy it. And you tend to get reviewed by people who aren't paid very much and who review your flap copy.
So you think that in order to succeed, an author should try and break out of that genre label?
I don't know about an author. I mean, there are people who are doing very well. I have had to see what I could do about breaking out just because I felt that I had plateaued. I had a fairly decent science fiction audience, nothing to write home about, but fairly decent, and it wasn't growing. And my books weren't selling more and more and more in any serious way. But I knew that I had other audiences or other potential audiences. I knew that I had a feminist audience, I knew that I had a black audience, and in some cases, for instance, a New Age audience, and I suppose a general audience. So some of these groups, the black, feminist, and New Age, they have bookstores, what's left of independent bookstores, but I was really interested in reaching these people. And when I was selling to science fiction only publishers or publishers who had their little science fiction department where they kind of wanted to keep you, I didn't feel that I was reaching them because the marketing people didn't really care about advertising to anybody but the science fiction audience. I went with a small publisher in the hope of reaching more people, which is an odd thing to do, but I did. And it actually did work. When I went with, it was at that time 4 Walls, 8 Windows, I wound up doing for the first time a book tour. It was sort of an abbreviated book tour, but it was a book tour. And finally, I was able to get out there and push the book. Before that, people said, oh, well, we only do that with our best-selling authors. Talk about self-fulfilling. Anyway, finally, being able to do that, I reached more people. I remember my editor was a little afraid even then to approach feminist bookstores, but he had no problem approaching black bookstores. And then he discovered the feminist bookstores were approaching him saying, what, you mean she was in town and you didn't send her to us? So I was reaching the people that I had been hoping to reach.
So to reach beyond that classic 14-year-old boy audience...
But that's not really the audience. That's just presumed to be the audience by people who don't like science fiction or think they don't.
Well, my question is, did you find yourself doing anything to reach beyond that audience, apart from going to a new publisher, or is it all on the marketing and business side?
It was a question of how I was perceived, not what I was doing. I don't think it was ever a question of what I was doing.
So the books that were marketed as SF are just as interesting to those new audiences?
They seem to be, which surprised me a little bit, but then again, they do have strong female characters, so why not?
Well, some of your books had been out of print for a while, and some have just been reissued?
No, not just. Actually, they've been in print for quite a long time. They are being re-released in different forms. For instance, Dawn, Adulthood, Rights, and Imago will be coming out in June as a book called Lilith's Brood. I wish I'd named it something else because it ties up my tongue every time I say it. But anyway, that's the new title, and it'll be 3 books in one. Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents are now out as a set, trade paperback set. So, I mean, they were available before. one as a hardcover and one as a mass market paperback. So they were around, and my earlier books have been out for a long time, but they have had different covers, different printings, that kind of thing.
Well, what's caused this reissuing and republishing of your work?
Um, Marketing. I mean, you keep the book on the bookshelves by giving it a new look. I mean, that's not very romantic, but it's true.
I thought it might have been increased interest in your work.
Well, I'm glad there is the interest, but in order to keep it on the shelves, there has to be something different about it, something new about it, a new cover, a new, well, for instance, from hardcover to mass market paperback, that kind of thing, or from mass market to trade paperback, oddly enough.
Let me step back and ask you to tell us a little bit about how you got started as a writer.
I began writing when I was 10. I began trying to sell when I was 13. I had been writing horse stories at 10. I began writing romances at 11. Didn't know a thing about horses or romances, I'm glad to say. When I was 12, I discovered science fiction, liked it, and began trying to sell it. I found a copy of a magazine called The Writer, and found it on a bus seat where someone had left it. And because of that, I found out how you submit things for publication. And I was often collecting rejection slips.
When was your first sale? How old were you?
Oh, not until I was 23. I was at Clarion, and I sold 2 short stories while there to editors who were there.
And that would be the Clarion Science Fiction Writing Workshop.
That's right.
Tell me about that. How did you hear about it? What made you decide to go to Clarion?
Well, I didn't know anything about Clarion. I didn't know anything about conventions or fandom. I just liked to read the stuff and to write it. When I was, let's see, I was in a class. The Writers Guild of America West was giving a screenwriting class. I didn't care about screenwriting either, but Harlan Ellison was teaching one of the classes. I got into his class, and I got into the class of another teacher named Sid Stiebel, and learned what I could from them because I hadn't really had much success with what I'd picked up in college, where people did think science fiction was that weird stuff that you should grow out of. And Harlan suggested that I might want to go to Clarion. And he was a teacher that year, so that even though they had closed admissions pretty much, I got in because of him, and went and was terrified the whole time I was there, but wrote furiously. And as I mentioned, sold 2 stories. I thought I was off. I thought I was a writer. Didn't sell another word for 5 years.
Do you think,
which happens a lot, by the way, to Clarion people.
well, I was going to ask, do you think Clarion is useful for an aspiring writer?
Oh, yes. Yes, because all your teachers are people who are writing for a living, and that matters a great deal. Your teacher is not an English teacher who doesn't necessarily know what the market is doing and how to help you break in. Your teacher is someone who is out there in it and who can tell you the truth and who will give you good criticism.
And now that you're in that role yourself, do you go back and teach at Clarion?
Yes, I do a Clarion every couple of years. I do a lot of speaking at universities and colleges. I kind of like it, actually, because I know how difficult it was for me when I was getting started. There was no one at first. Before I found the Screenwriters Guild in Harlan and all that, there was just literally nobody. So I know people have these questions to ask, and if I can answer them, I'm glad to do it.
Your work often deals with urban societies. How do you see the future of America's cities?
Oh, my.
In 30 words or less.
Right. I have no idea how to answer that. I suppose I could tell you to take a look at Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. Now, that isn't prophecy, I hope. The society that I portray in these two books is pretty much broken. People are living, well, the people who are surviving with any decency at all are living in walled communities and risking their lives whenever they go out. There are a lot of reasons for this. Drugs, of course, and deterioration of public education, the environmental situation. Global warming is practically a character in Parable of the Sower. Lots of other things that have simply, they're problems now. They become disasters because they're not attended to. And I hope, of course, that we will be smarter than that.
Are you a pessimist or an optimist?
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. I don't think. Okay, what I've noticed about the human species over my lifetime, Butler's words of wisdom, is that we do tend to go to the edge more often than we ought to. You know, we go to the edge and then we look and we realize, my God, that's a precipice. We could fall over, we could die, and we draw back. The problem is with something like global warming, you can't just draw back and make it okay. With nuclear war, you can. I mean, the Soviet Union decided not to exist any longer. So we're probably not going to have a nuclear war, at least not for a generation or two, until someone else decides that it might be a really fun thing to do. But with global warming, after you've spent over a century messing things up, by the time you decide to fix it, your grandchildren might see some results, but chances are you won't.
I couldn't let this interview end without asking you about this. In 1995, you won a MacArthur Fellowship, a very prestigious award. How did that award change your life, or did it?
Well, it did something that most freelancers, I think, would really enjoy. If you're working freelance, no matter how well you're doing, you don't always know when the money's going to come. And even if you know how much is going to be coming, which you don't necessarily because it's royalties, you don't know when, even though you know when it's supposed to. With the MacArthur quarterly check, you know when and you know how much. And that's an enormous help. It helped me buy a house, which is really very good. And it was financial security for those 5 years. And for the future, to some degree, I suppose. So it was a very useful thing. It did something else that money alone can't really do. I think it caused me to be taken more seriously by people who wouldn't normally take science fiction all that seriously. And I think that matters.
Now, you're the only science fiction author to have won the MacArthur Fellowship. Is that correct?
I don't know, but if I am, very proud of it.
Let me wrap up by asking what we can expect to see from you next. What are you working on?
Oh, I'm working on a third parable book that will have no characters in common with the first two. It's not about the nasty future of Earth that I portray in the first two. It's about the people who decide to leave, who decide to follow the destiny of this new religion, Earthseed. The destiny of Earthseed is to take root among the stars. And these people leave, they go to another world around another sun, and that means that they have left Earth for good. It means that they're not going to see anyone else from Earth for the rest of their lives. It means that they're going to have to deal with whatever they find on this new world. It's not about meeting strange-looking people or anything like that. It's about what I'm going for is the most human situation I can of people who are trying to establish themselves on another world that is definitely not just another Earth, and that they can't escape from and have to deal with.
Well, we look forward to seeing that. And thank you, Octavia Butler, for joining us here on Fast Forward.
Thank you.